All right, hello class. So I'm going to help you out with the Obamanomics assignment. Hopefully this is going to be a better and shorter review video for you that will make the assignment a lot easier. So we've talked a little bit about the differences in conservative and liberal economic ideologies, and we've talked about how they've changed across time. And so, really up until, from Reagan up until Trump, kind of laissez-faire economic policy has been kind of a common thread uniting conservative economic ideology. Essentially let the market run, minimal governmental interference in the market. There might be some things that we don't like about society, but to quote Ronald Reagan, government is not the solution to our problems, it is the problem. And then there was a hostility to labor unions, which had commonly supported left parties and the welfare state, legacy social programs, like Social Security to an extent, I suppose, and unemployment benefits, transfer programs, stuff like that, and a hostility also to progressive taxation. So we talked about progressive taxation in this class. It's the idea that as your income rises, the rate that you pay in taxes also increases. So like the highest income earners in society pay a higher income tax than the rest of us as a percentage, a proportion of their income, I think the top income tax bracket is what, 28.5% or 30%, something around there. Obviously, I'm not in the top income tax bracket. But it was a much more progressive taxation system before Ronald Reagan. At one point, the highest income earners in society paid a top income tax of around 60%. So you can see sort of the outcome of that hostility in lasting policy, sort of making our tax system less progressive. And so there's a macroeconomic argument that Republicans cited in the 80s for that. And we can talk about it later, but just Google Art Laffer and the Laffer curve, and I'm sure you can find an article about that from a reputable source, hopefully a reputable source. So liberal economic ideology, this has been a common thread in liberal economic ideology. But the reason I put pre-Carter is because the second bullet point, but it's this idea that the government can intervene to positively affect people's lives, especially the disadvantaged. In the Trump years, we saw a lot of governmental intervention in the economy. The idea, sort of a hostility to labor unions and perhaps some welfare and social programs did exist in the Trump years, but there was also some quite an extensive amount of government intervention, specifically on trade policy. So Trump kind of complicates or doesn't really fit neatly into the conservative economic ideology sort of box. But this embrace of labor unions and the welfare state, the reason why we see a decline in labor unionization since the 70s. And so we see the left party in our country start to move towards the center as the political power of labor unions becomes increasingly dwindles. And we also see sort of an embrace of free trade policies, especially in the Clinton years, right? Famously with the North American Free Trade Agreement, sort of, again, moving away from the interests of organized labor as labor unionization rates decline, and more towards the center, adopting some planks of Reaganomics and Reagan economic policy. And I guess still an embrace of social programs. Variety of legacy social programs, I should say. And so your assignment seems difficult, but it's actually very, very simple. Essentially what you're doing is you're reading that article on Obamanomics, and you're taking 4 economic models, right? Or first you're translating the prose, right, into an economic model. You're translating the prose into an economic model. And then you're going to tell me Obama's interpretation of that model, right? Like how would he, if he were your AP microeconomics teacher, lecture about this model? How is he interpreting this model? How is he using this model or discarding some of the insights of this model to come up with his economic ideology and his policies? And then finally, we're trying to see if we can relate the interpretation, the Obama interpretation of the model, to the thesis of the article, which is Obama is both more right-wing and more left-wing than people realize, which is a paradox, seemingly contradictory statement that seems not to be able to be true, but actually is. Right? Okay. So as you're reading the article, right, I put a whole bunch of keys for you, as you can see here. In green, I put can be turned into a microeconomics model. And then I was so nice, I even drew the model for you, right? But you have to do a bit of interpretation, a little bit more mental work, but I kind of, help you out, lead you to the model I'm thinking of. And then, of course, you have to tell me how Obama potentially interprets this model, which you should gain insight into that from reading this. And then in blue, you see AP government concepts or ideas that I lectured about in the more extensive YouTube video, but I would imagine a probably less helpful YouTube video because it was probably too much information. But certainly those AP government concepts and ideas include stuff like the median voter theorem, the shift in democratic politics and liberal economic ideologies more towards the center in the Clinton years, the embrace of what we're going to call neoliberalism. What else are we going to talk about? Some extra resources on the financial crisis, which isn't going to be necessarily stuff we're going to talk about before the AP microeconomics exam because it's a more AP microeconomics type issue, but we are going to watch a documentary on it after the exams. And stuff like that. But those resources are in the footnotes, and there are several different resources and links in the footnotes. And then finally in yellow you have some ACT vocabulary words and some stylistic elements in how Leonhardt presented his argument that I wanted to highlight. Okay, so first model we can see, which I drew here, was the Lorenz curve, right? The piece talks a lot about income inequality, and we have a tool, right? We have a graph, we have a model that can help us tell the story of income inequality in our society and across societies, and really compare income inequality across societies. And the idea behind this is that models in economics, the reason why we use them is because they can tell very sophisticated stories in ways that are very succinct, in ways that are very attractive visually, and in ways that allow us to eventually use them as tools and recall very easily when we're reading stuff in the news, right? And so it talks about expanding income inequality. It talks specifically about how workers below in the bottom 60% of our society virtually experienced no income growth, and all of the income growth over the year 2000, because there was an expansion of the economy since 2000, essentially went to the top income earners in society, right? So the way we can use this model, right, this Lorenz curve, to help assist us in this story, right, this kind of setting, right, the author provides a setting, right, it doesn't yet tell us how Obama necessarily would think about income inequality yet, but it's sort of the context behind Obama's rise politically, right, is we have in this model on the y-axis the cumulative percentage of income, and then on the x-axis the cumulative percentage of the population. And then we can imagine that we have a line of perfect equality, right, which is a 45-degree line through the origin, which reflects this idea that at 5% of the population, they own exactly 5% of the income. At 50% of the population, they own exactly 50% of the income. And of course, that's an extreme that doesn't actually exist. And then graphically, we represent the actual distribution of incomes in society with the Lorenz curve, right? And the Lorenz curve tells us how far away we are from perfect equality, perfect income equality, right? And we can see at this Lorenz curve, it seems like 5% of the population owns less than 1% of the wealth. And then we can go on, so on and so forth. And then from this Lorenz curve, we can calculate what is called a Gini coefficient, right? We take the area above the Lorenz curve and beneath the line of perfect equality and put that in the numerator. And then the area essentially beneath the line of perfect equality, essentially this right triangle area right here, which is A plus B in the denominator, and we come up with a number. Right, the closer that number is to 1, the more unequal the income distribution in society is. The closer it is to 0, the more equal the income distribution in society is. Let's think about that, why that makes sense for a moment. Well, if it's 0, right, if we get a number of 0, that would happen in which the area underneath the Lorenz curve, right, or the Lorenz curve is the line of perfect equality and a perfectly equal income distribution, right? And so there is no area underneath the Lorenz curve, or underneath the line of perfect equality and the Lorenz curve, so that's just 0. 0 divided by anything is 0. So we know that that represents perfect equality. And then finally the Gini coefficient, or the Gini coefficient of 1 of perfect inequality, that would be a system in which only the last person owns all of the wealth, right? And so basically the Lorenz curve becomes this sort of right triangle area here, right? The area under the line of perfect equality becomes this right triangle area here, which is the same as A plus B, right? So it's essentially A plus B divided by A plus B equals 1, reflecting perfectly unequal society. And so, of course, those are both extremes, but then we can see how unequal the income distribution in society actually is using those numbers and statistics, right? So we have the graphical tool, and then we actually have the Gini coefficient, right? And you can look up Gini coefficients in reality. And then finally, as you're reading the article, it doesn't say up front in the article, but it says later, right? It talks about Obama's taxation policies in the article, and it tells you that he seems to be very concerned with income inequality. He thinks it's a pressing issue, more so than the expanding budget deficit. And so here's where you tell me how Obama, if he were taking Mr. Diaz's class, would interpret this graph. And so Obama might say, you know, he's very concerned with what seems to be an expansion of the Lorenz curve, right? Maybe we want to shift the Lorenz curve out. And so you can do it very different ways. Obama might say is concerned, and you always want to reference the model with the expansion of Lorenz curve, and or you can talk about maybe a Gini coefficient approaching 1 or getting closer to 1 / Gini closer to 1, right? Wants to redistribute, right? And so you'll find out that the way and mechanism he uses is through tax policy, or not he uses, this article was written before he actually became president, so we actually have to do a bit of fact checking, but this article does predict a lot of the policies that he eventually implements. But his stated, tax policy is like, let's raise taxes on the top income earners, let's give tax cuts to everybody below the top income earners to essentially redistribute wealth through taxation policy. We don't have to put that complication here, but we still want to see, how does this support or relate to Leonhardt's thesis? Well, this seems to be, right, he's very concerned about income inequality. He's concerned about the budget deficit, but less, right? In the article, it says that he's not as concerned about the budget deficit. So this is kind of more a, Obama being a little bit more left-wing than I suppose Clinton was in the Clinton years, right? Because Clinton would be the reference point. And then, of course, we'll run through the other models.